I'm just going to wait a minute to let the wing join. Otherwise, if there's no news, we can just start the debate. Okay, there seems to be no response from Judy. Ah, well, we are already running behind schedule. Just want to remind everybody, if any time during the debate you have an audio problem, whether you're a judge or you're a debater, please indicate in the chat as soon as possible. And also prior to starting your speech, if you could indicate how you would like POIs to be expressed to you. Unfortunately, my camera on because I'm really anxious about losing internet connection, but I am here, rest assured, and I will be keeping time. You should be able to hear the bells go off. With that being said, I now welcome the Prime Minister. Here.
I'm going to assume I'm audible. I'd prefer POIs in the chat. It will probably take one around 2 minutes. I've been playing Dota 2 since I was about 13, and very sadly, no matter how much I love that game, the culture is toxic, and it has not been resolved by the glorification that exists for the professionals within that scene. That is why we're going to oppose this motion. 3 claims in setup before I get to my arguments. The first is to point out what glorification looks like, and we think it's 3 important prongs. The first is the glorification of the success that these professionals are able to get. That obviously scales. The most successful people like Thompson probably gets a lot of glorification. No names get very little. And it is a glorification of the sacrifices that people have put in to get that success. And the third prong is to explain that that glorification is something that attempts to add a coolness to these people that is otherwise lacking from outside social interactions, because people otherwise view esports as a kind of a lame, nerdy thing. The second point of setup is to explain that most professionals are not capable of being professional alone. That is not enough money for them. So they need to stream their content to add additional income, because the income of winning tournaments is very rare, noting very few people are able to win and succeed. And most companies or teams that support these people are not able to offer them salary incomes. And the second prong is to explain that that means they often have to rely on sponsors in that Twitch setup. The final thing to do in setup is to note that the people who watch this content are overwhelmingly young. They start as young as I did watching Twitch and playing Dota, and that means they're incredibly susceptible to things. I'm going to assume no clarification because that was pretty straightforward. First, let's explain why this increases consumption and that is bad for these people. Second, why you're likely to fail when you attempt to become professional, which you're likely to do because there's glorification. And finally, why glorification leads to the lack of critique of culture that is so problematic and systemic in these games. First is to point out why you are likely to increase the consumption of video games. The first is to point out who it was. I've already said this is teenagers. So the first incentive here is just, I'm not particularly cool. I'm probably nerdy. I'm probably bullied or something like that. I like this video game and I'm looking for a 1, measure of success and something I can brag about to get social kudos, and 2, something cool. So when I see someone like Thompson, see someone like Flanker, see someone like No Tail succeeding, I want to be like that person and I want to follow in those footsteps. So I attempt to do the same thing they do. And the glorification talks about the sacrifices and the hours they've put into those things. So I attempt to replicate that. Importantly, this other component of this success is to explain that this can be a successful career, which means you don't think you're making a trade-off that you otherwise might realize you're doing so when you're an older or more mature person, but you're unlikely to as a child. The third thing to say here is you then look for that coolness. And finally, you're unlikely to be regulated by your parents in this context because they are unlikely to be able to control your consumption. They can't control how often you're on the computer and stuff like that in a technological world. I'll take that POI from whoever's hands up. I think it's over. No, from
So if I
Sarah,
want to be a really good debater, I'll look up to what the really good debaters are doing, whether they're glorified or not, because I want to be competitive and I want to be good because I love the game. Glorification or no glorification? How is that exclusive?
Oh man, like if this is your tactic in the debate, like you're just going to turn it into a clusterfuck. Like obviously the glorification here is not just I'm looking for success. I explained that there was other components to it, but the success is obviously following things. So this is not just like you succeeded and we should say well done. This is like you're a king, like you're excellent, you're a great person, like all those other things. Like we all know what glorification is. Don't make the debate a mess. So this just means that you're likely to follow those people because they're your role models here. Why is this so harmful? There's a series of trade-offs you're unlikely to be particularly cognizant of. You're likely to not focus on your education, spend long hours separating these things, spending time on this and not waking up with enough time to get to school or do homework. You're likely to become addicted to these things, to attempt to grind and become good. You are forgoing things like your social skills, your health, and work experience you might otherwise get. A series of things that are particularly useful for people's quality of life, but especially so for your ability to be a decent human being. And they are best achieved at the ages where people are most likely to be consuming this material, most likely to be under the views of glorification, and are most likely to attempt to follow these people down their footsteps, which means when you attempt to re-educate yourself with a very poor high school grade or not finishing your high school at all, it's incredibly hard to do so later down the track. Our second argument is to explain, if you follow this, you attempt to be good by the glorification, you attempt to be like someone who's your role model, you're likely to fail, and that's incredibly harmful. The first, why are you likely to fail? The first is to explain that the skill ceiling in the vast majority of games is incredibly high, so you do need to put the hours in. Second is to explain there's a limited scope for success, which you need to compete against a great number of people to be able to succeed. And the final thing to point out here, the third thing to point out here is it's relatively hard to find you even if you do succeed. So if you do start getting good, it is still luck of the draw. And the final thing to explain here is there's internet inequality. That is to point out that a vast majority of the world exists in a situation where they have to deal with lag. And in real world games, that gives you a huge disadvantage, which means people from more privileged outcomes are likely to achieve here, but those in disprivileged worlds are unlikely to. So this explains that you're likely to be generating of harmful things for you the rest of your life, but you're incapable of getting the near-term benefit of going successful, going professional, because you are likely to fail and it's incredibly hard to succeed in this mode. Final and probably most important argument explaining why glorification leads to a situation where you can't critique the cultural problems that exist in these industries and in these games. I've already explained why these culture problems exist, but I want to get a little more specific here. That is, video games often work in a situation where people get hot-headed or pissed off about losing, and that leads to a series of slow usage by a series of actors. And when you glorify these people as successful, as role models, as people you should follow, you also tacitly agree that that language use is useful or acceptable, which is obviously not. It generates a system where a series of people would like to join these video games and feel safe in these communities, but can't do so because things like homophobic slurs and racial slurs are used. But we have a second mechanism here, which is a series of explanations for why this is worse than other sports. 3 reasons. The first is to point out that they're likely younger. Second is to explain this is a largely anonymous system, so you can get away with that language without much critique. And the third is to find there's very little adult oversight, which is often the thing that stops us doing things like swearing or being rude to people. And that means there's very bad language and very bad behavior and flaming and attacking people. But this comes from the leaders in these communities, the people these people look up to, and they're unlikely to look up to other role models in their world because they don't think anything else is particularly cool when this glorification has explained that someone like Thompson is very cool. So you're not going to look up to a teacher or a father figure or something like that and have the correction of those behaviors implied to you in the real world because you aren't going to listen to them because you don't think they're cool enough to be a glorification, to be a role model. And that means that the leaders in this community promote a culture that is incredibly toxic, and calling them out just doesn't work because that is a situation where other people who are streamers have to forego some of their followers to call out the person that is viewed as cooler than them or call out the person who's more successful to them, which just leads to things like copy pasta saying, but you're fucking salty. No, why would you defend women? You're a simp. Shit like that. That's incredibly toxic. It's only defended if we view these people as perfect images of esports or players. If we don't do this, if we allow these people to admit they fucked up, they said something incorrect, rude, that world, people don't play so many video games, and we are able to that it's so proud to govern.
All right, I thank that speaker. I now welcome the leader of the opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'll prefer my POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think in esports and in society as a whole, there are structural incentives that cause esports at the moment that they actually become larger and more glorified in society to become more positive and less toxic, which is a large part of the case I'm going to give, i.e. why is it going to be the case that there are going to be positive effects on the gamer community as a whole from this glorification. I will in that uniquely add the comparative of what would happen at the moment that there wouldn't be glorification, because I think that is largely missing from the side of opening government. Before I'm going to bring you our case, I'm going to give you 2 separate points of rebuttal on 2 of their points. One on the whole issue of the culture and what is going on. Panel, I think it's important to note here that uniquely the comparative is that at the moment that these esports are not necessarily glorified, at the moment that we don't care about these sporters in society at a larger scale and that we start really seeing them as heroes in society, what we see is that the gamer community is going to be a very excluded community, which hides somewhere on the corners of Twitch and Reddit and don't necessarily deal with society as a whole, which means that it is likely that there is going to be even less scrutiny on this community. We say that perhaps it is the case that change is slow, but we say that it is going to be more likely to happen under our side of the house, given the fact that at least more people are concerned by esports, know what is going on, and can have a conversation about it with gamers that they otherwise would not necessarily have. Then secondly, on the whole issue of the amount of time investments, etc., I think that this is just a plain assertion that parents cannot control time because it's on the internet. It might sound a little bit barbaric, but when I was on internet for too long, my parents just pulled out the internet cable. I think that genuinely this is something that you can do as a parent. This is something that you can control. Also, children specifically, given the fact that they want to talk about young children, still do have to go to school. So they might lose some sleep over it, but this is not something that cannot be controlled. And again, as I will argue, given the fact that with the glorification of esports, it is actually going to be likely that more people see the way in which esports work and can have a conversation with their children about it. Regulating that is going to get more easy. I'll take a POI later. All right, so I think that we do agree largely with opening government that yes, it is the case that the glorification of esporters is about more than just their performances and their success, but that it's also about the sacrifices they are making and the way in which they shape their lives, because that's the only way in which they are going to be recognizable. What opening government then fails to do is explain what that would actually look like, and specifically, as we will prove, why that will mean that the glorification will be done in a positive manner. I think that given the fact that we want heroes to be as recognizable as possible, also in esports, what we want to do is the fact that we want to make sure that people look well, that they are healthy, that they do have some kind of personal network that they can actually attach to, because otherwise they would never get glorified and get the status, because they would seem like an odd person. I think that these are the fact that you want to be understandable is a specific reason why a lot of people think Messi is far more understandable and more of a hero than Ronaldo is, because Ronaldo turns out to be a little bit of a jerk at times as well, right? So we say these are things that actually also matter, but that makes it likely that you are going to glorify people who have positive things. This does a couple of things in this debate panel. One, this takes out the whole issue that it is going to be likely that the cultural issues that we have in the community are actually being caused by the most authoritative figures. I think that this is just not necessarily true, because at the moment that we glorify people, you don't necessarily recognize. But secondly, and this is where I go further on the analysis community, we also say that this is something positive on those people who are gay, because uniquely striving towards coolness is something that has been out of reach for community for a very long time. There have been for a very long time people who actually want to belong to a social group, who want to do that, but could not necessarily do that, given the fact that they weren't sporty in the way that we glorified. Because panel, note here that it's crucial to note that the glorification of esporters is not just something in a vacuum, but that interacts with other glorifications in society as well. At the moment that you would not have a glorification of esporters, people who are now part of the gamer community and decide that they prefer doing that, training their digital skills, having a digital community over going to a basketball team fall outside of the social spectrum. And we think that that is incredibly harmful. We think that specifically the glorification of esporters in this is unique in making sure that you can have a community that's both understood in society as well as within your own community for a couple of reasons. One, because everyone is striving towards more common goals that you can actually look up to, i.e. that means young children already trying be like better at their esports, etc. In the same way that young guys want to be better football players to be like Ronaldo. Note panel, this doesn't crush the dreams of all guys who ever play soccer in their life, so we don't necessarily think that failure is that big of an issue for people, but say that in that sense, at the moment towards these common goals and have someone to look up to and see how you can do that is something that uniquely unites people. But also to the extent that it happens that now people outside of the original gamer community are going to see this glorification and be aware of, say, the Dutch FIFA players that are doing really, really well or something. That means that there's also going to be broader understanding of the society as a whole for what these communities actually look like, which is going to lead to further interaction with that community. Before I'm going to analyze that further, I would love to take a POI from closing if they have some.
I'm sorry, busy.
Okay, opening.
The problem with this case is glorification doesn't extend outside of the communities, and that's because the actors who glorify players are things like game developers, so they don't actually have the spread.
I think that that's literally just false to the extent that I know that there are Dutch esporters who are actually doing very well in specific games, who are on the Dutch news and actually show up more and more. That might be because we have some very technological savvy universities, but we see that the more of a glorification there is, the more likely it is that people from their gamer community are going to feel proud and are going to share the information as well. That means, like, till the same extent that at the moment that the Dutch universities won Euros or did very well in Worlds, they could come in the Dutch newspapers. We literally think that if debaters can do that, then esporters can do that as well. There's no structural reason to believe why not. Concretely, this has three impacts. One, outsider communities are going to be more likely to have a proper understanding of what is going on in the gaming community because of the fact that they now have seen what a healthy gaming addiction looks like, or a healthy gaming obsession or striving in that looks like. That means that as a parent, you know more about it. It is easier to talk with your children at the moment that they're going down the rabbit hole of gaming to actually see why they are being toxic, what is not the right thing, and they can relate that to the heroes to make sure that you can change their behavior. We think that that is good for the understanding people have in society, but also feeling cool is just good for the mental health of children. And we say, given that these are likely to going to be more healthy role models, it is also likely that people are going to be more healthy. Very proud to oppose.
Right, I thank that speaker. I now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Hi everyone. As I get up my timer, I'm going to talk just in case someone needs to let me know that I am inaudible. All right. I would prefer POIs to be sent in the chat. If at 5 minutes and 30 seconds I haven't taken your POI, please feel free to turn on your camera and let me know with your voice. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. OG has two main claims. OOs has two main claims. They tell us firstly that through failing to explain what this glorification looks like, that automatically the mechanisms that were proven in Tom's speech just suddenly must not count. However, we do characterize this and I'll go on to further do that. Secondly, they provide one main point, which is that by connecting the esports world more to society and associating it with the glorification of other activities such as football, we can create a world where we get impacts of more healthy playing in sport. Now, the main problem with this push that they had was firstly that it relied on the assumption that glorification was actually touching these parts of society. And that is where I ask you to look at the motion. Whereas we are opposing the glorification of the players, the professional players in esports, and not the glorification of video games in and of themselves or of gaming communities, of the idea that you can stream on Twitch. All of those things are fine to be glorified, but we do not support glorifying going professional and being a pro player because we believe it leads to insane and extreme behaviors. The second thing to say was that in terms of making a positive effect from glorification, and that now parents can see what healthy looks like and are more likely to let their 13-year-old sons, happily engage healthy gameplay a day because we've glorified these successful players. This has a big logic leap, speaker, which is that it is contingent on someone being able to be successful and also engage in esports in a healthy way. This is empirically impossible in the esports professional playing community. That is to say, when you are a professional player and you are also glorified, all the things you had to do to get there are glorified and try to be imitated by the people who want to be just like you. That is, firstly, doing things competing against them an extreme amount of hours. But secondly, on the mechanism that Tom told you, which is that winning competitions, if you are freakishly naturally hundreds and hundreds of hours per year was possible, it's still not enough money. You need to get the majority of your money from streaming on platforms such as Twitch. And the way that you get views on Twitch is inherently linked to doing glorified and extreme actions. That is to say, an average 45-minute healthy stream is not exciting viewing. However, a 100-hour continuous stream is something that will gather millions of views on Twitch because people are interested in the extremity of it and the glorification of the fact that you are doing something above and beyond what an average human or an average player would do. And that's where the glorification comes in that we must oppose. Thirdly, we think that the stress that's placed on the sacrifice is the only way to become a pro player, and to have that level of skill is something that cannot be replicated while being healthy and not playing that much because of the amount of hours it takes to develop that level of autonomous skill. So dealing with that, I like to take a POI from closing before I move on to whipping our case.
Which fuels addiction to games more, the dopamine hit from winning Mario Kart or looking up to some nerds streaming on Twitch?
I think that the line of this POI is sort of to suggest that video games are, addictive in either world, and maybe that there's a world where they're going to say, you play the same amount of hours no matter what. I think that this is empirically false because what we see when we have glorification is we have people who are pro. The biggest impacted group in this debate is the people who are close to being professional players and really want to. They probably have small Twitch channels and they want to become a source of income from that. And so they have an incentive acting upon them to increase the amount of what they would naturally want to do. And that's where they get viewers and that's where they get interesting. So that is to say they force themselves to stay up on a stream, which the title is, I will not log off this stream until I get 10K in donations. I will not log off this stream until I get 600 kills. And that's what gets them the views. And that is the best and fastest mechanism for them to do that. That incentive forces them to engage in the game more than priorities of things like sleep, of exercise, of eating healthy food, of socializing with people and protecting your mental health. So to whip our case, firstly, we explained to you that glorification looks like making these players seem above human and glorifying things like the sacrifices that they make. That is to say that in our world where pro players aren't glorified, it means that they are no longer required to seem as perfect all the time and always extreme and always sacrificing, which means that we get a couple of things. Firstly, we solve this clash in the opening half about what is going to force more extreme and harmful behavior, because it means that they're not being glorified for those things. They are able to act more like a healthy human, which is what the benefit of OI wanted to claim. They're more able to engage with the internet in a healthy and normal way. They're no longer glorified. But secondly, and importantly, to the second point of our case, which is about the toxic culture that is currently not able to be criticized because of glorification. And this is where I would like to call attention to the POI we get from opening opposition, which is that, if I want to be a great debater, I can still, look up to people, even though, they might be putting in more effort than me, or it might force me to practice more or whatever. But the fact is that if you were glorified as a debater, it would mean that there would be me, say I'm a glorified pro debater if debating is equivalent to esports. I say something like, no men can join this debate and argue against me because men are stupid. Oh, that man is probably just a photo of a man with a woman behind him telling him all his arguments. And then no one will say anything to me about it because I'm glorified, because I'm the most glorious debater who wins all the competitions, because I'm the best current streamer on Twitch. And there is an echo chamber created by that. So what is the impacts of this lack of critique of culture? Firstly, it means that audiences are likely to fail to criticize you because they know that they will lose subscribers or trying to support the glorified player. Secondly, it means that people are likely to copy and mimic your behavior in order to ingratiate themselves to your audience in order to create their own growth and success. That is to say, you don't speak against a Fortnite channel because everyone will hate you and they'll send you hate mail through their anonymous accounts and that you won't get any subscribers that day. Rather, you copy the behavior that you see is making Ninja so successful. The fact that he makes comments about women and that he gets away with it, that's something that then echoes through the culture and makes it very toxic. It means that the impact to women in this debate is immeasurable when we glorify these players, because it makes women have no safe spaces when the gatekeepers are required to constantly glorify themselves. It means that they are in a position where they cannot admit defeat. It means when they lose a kill that they say things like, oh, I meant to lose that, because they're so glorified that they can't admit any level of failure for fear of losing subscribers and for fear of losing sponsors. And it means that they also do things like want to be extremely defensive about anybody who threatens to take their glorification away from them, which means that currently, because the status quo allows them to put out a whole 50% of players of women by making them sound derogatory and make comments about them, they are incentivized to actively do that and encourage that amongst their audiences in order to reduce the competition. At the end of the debate, by removing this glorification, we made faster progress for removing toxicity, and we made faster progress for removing extreme actions, and so we won the debate.
All right, I thank that speaker. I now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
All right, give me 1 second. All right. In 3, 2, 1. Two very simple things in this speech. First, I'm going to explain why glorification isn't necessarily the thing that makes people compare themselves or create a toxic culture that is happening in a lot of top sports or a lot of top places where people want to be very competitive. The second is why I think it's very necessary for a lot of people to feel connected, and why that's and why that is a necessary thing. Constructive case then will be very simple as well. The first thing is why this actually allows for the scrutiny that is so necessary in places where it tends to spin out of control. And the second thing is why I think that it's also really good to recreate or reshape stereotypes that currently exist. Let's start with the rebuttal. The first thing is that I don't think that every impact that they explain is exclusive to the point of glorification. That's to say, the moment where I want to be really good because I have an interest in something is the moment where I will look up to people who are better at that thing. The moment where I want to be really good is the moment where I look at Emma Lucas before she was glorified because she won every tournament that I saw her do, and then think, oh, maybe I want to be like her. And if that means that Emma skips every single meal that she has in a day because she's stressed, I will start doing that too. It has nothing to do with her glorification. It has everything to do with my competitive needs in order to be just as good as she is. And I don't think that glorification shapes her interest. That is to say, I was already interested in debating, and then I start looking at the people who are good. Even if Messi is glorified, I don't give a shit about football. I'm very sorry for all football fans here. So regardless of how glorified Messi is, it doesn't mean I suddenly want to be a football player. It does mean that I look positively towards other people who play football because I get that is cool. But the toxic parts and the toxic culture are created by the competitiveness and the need for people to win. Also, especially because the moment where you invest a lot of things because you want to win out of your inherent interest, that is happening anyway. So I don't think that impact is exclusive. The second mistake they then make is that they say the moment where you want to look up to someone, you're suddenly going to devote all your resources to it just so that you can do that same thing as well. One, the moment where you no longer look up to someone and you don't do that. And one, I don't think that is true. The moment where you really are good at something and you look up to someone is the moment where you suddenly go, I want to do all those other things. But I think that's uniquely true for the gaming industry, right? Because the moment where you look up to someone and that person is as toxic as they describe, they don't eat very healthy, they don't do all the good things, is the moment where that is counterfactual to the narrative of having social friends or social life or all those other things which are more glorified in society in terms of having. So I don't think that everybody who has a happy social life will give that up just to become a gamer, because that is counterintuitive to the narrative that is happening currently in society. I think the people that are already in the gaming industry are more likely to look up to them and now have healthy examples. Why those healthy examples are likely to be good is then what I'm going to explain and why that's exclusive. So far the OG case is out. Cool. First, why is it likely that glorification will actually happen healthily? One, because currently a lot of people who are really good at something are really good because they sustainably been doing it for a while. That's to say, I think the stereotype OG has is exactly the problem in this debate. That means that the gamers who are really good at gaming at this moment are the ones that are horribly toxic, or say eat horribly unhealthy, or don't have any friends or social life at all. Why? Because it tends to get you depressed, because it tends to get you very unhappy, it tends to get you not a good life, which means you don't keep on doing the same thing over and over again until you're really good, because you're just literally gonna break down. That's to say, I think a lot of top supporters are really good because they've made it integrated into such a way that it's sustainable. I think that is a good example specifically here, because you don't tend to get a hernia or take drugs in the same way that cyclists do. Specifically in the gaming industry, I think having a healthy lifestyle is uniquely the thing you need to do in order to put that up. The second thing is that I think in general, even if we buy every part, if they say, oh, but we're going to mitigate it and squirrel it to such a way that's only happening in the same community, I still think that it's good, right? Because what happens also when the moment where someone is really glorified, if you go on a stage panel, you may notice as really excellent debaters, the moment where you are being the glorified person and the moment where your name is on every Facebook page is also the moment where haters gonna hate, because everybody suddenly wants to have an opinion on you. That means that you are more under scrutiny, or more under a lens into that you should have a healthy lifestyle, and every other part of you that could also be glorified, because glorification doesn't just happen on you having a good skill, but you having a really good lifestyle or a really great other forms of personality overall. That means that you're actually going to be more monitoring into whether these people are actually good or not, or whether they actually spend very unhealthy things. That's the moment where the scandals come up and all those other things. That means that there is actually more, specifically in a field that is apparently, according to OG, so likely to be very toxic to people. That's the moment where there's going to be more monitoring on it, because it's more often in the news, because there's more research to it, because there's more visual representation of these kind of people. The second thing why I then think that glorification is good is because I think the people who are going to visualize this glorification are the people that are already really invested in the gaming industry, that are currently really being bullied for the fact that they are not having friends, because there are so much stereotypes against this industry, because there are so many things that say, oh, this is only for the fat and the unhealthy people. I think those people will not have any friends suddenly the moment where this not happens, because that's why they started with gaming anyway, but now will that kind of representation to a direct engagement with OG. Oh, but now minorities are not going to think that they can, now minorities are going to think that they can do anything even though they don't have it. I don't think people are that irrational, but the alternative that they then have to represent literally is that you don't want to give examples for these minorities and they will never see themselves represented, which is another impact that we give you. That is to say, the moment where you glorify people, especially also to the outside world, it's the moment where it will suddenly stand out that there are only white people at the top, or that there will only be men at the top, and where there's actually going to be a call for diversity. All those kind of things only happen when there's people in media representation, when there's people in the news, and that only happens when you put them on a stage and glorify them. Before I continue, POI from closing.
So in your point about positive culture, where is your mechanistic link as to why if we criticize the people at the top, suddenly all gamers at the bottom who are not scrutinized will also change their behavior in a positive way?
For the same mechanisms that your own OG gives, the moment where you apparently see someone, you're going to copy their behavior and think that that's a really good thing. Like, I'm sorry, they did the work for me. I'm very happy. Cool. Then the final link that we have to explain to you is the reason why I think that glorification will not only happen inside the community, but also happen outside of the community. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is that literally we think that glorification means that there's going to be more media attention, that we're going to put more people on a pedestal, that there's going to be more discourse around us. And even if it's just on Facebook, the fact that we win worlds, or the fact that you win something else, means you get into the news, means that people will see you, means that people start talking about you. That's literally the point of glorification. Those kind of discourse things means that other people outside of you also think that whatever you're doing is apparently really cool, or at least noteworthy, or at least noteworthy of thinking about. It doesn't mean that suddenly my talents change or my interests change. It doesn't mean that I suddenly want to start football, even if I see the world championships for once, right, in football. It just means that I will finally think, oh, maybe this is cool to watch, or maybe this is something worth talking about to my friends. I still love debating more. I still love horse riding more. The moment where someone in horse riding is glorified, it does mean that I don't feel like the silly, stupid bitch that did horse riding for 6 years, but I feel really cool because there's a person that's really cool there, and the outside world will finally understand that. I think given that discourse, that's a more likely thing to happen. That reduces stereotypes, but it does also increase the discourse around it on the things that are actually toxic, which I think are really good. In the end, the people that are going to be experiencing the impacts of this will experience forms of impacts anyway. We think that it's better to monitor those impacts, allow for scrutiny, create more diversity, and actually create healthier standards for this entire community. And I'm so proud to oppose.
All right, I thank that speaker. And now to start off the closing half, I invite member of government. Here. I thank the speaker. I now welcome the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you just have to speak a little bit closer to the mic, or at least speak a bit louder.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. And just a quick note, occasionally there's been, do you want to increase the input volume a little bit?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Sorry, it doesn't work. Sorry, we're just trying to fix the tech issue, but it doesn't.
Okay, if at any point you have trouble hearing me, just please say it out loud because I might miss if it's in the chat. So I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry it's not being perfect right now. One of my sheets.
Maybe. Here. Check those.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Is anyone not ready? All right. The DPM is right to point out that video games were glorified far before the rise of professional corporate sponsorships. That is to say, PewDiePie on YouTube had millions for his content by particular companies. Even we think on closing opposition, what we will do is we will answer the question of why specifically the professional nature of esports is crucial and why we prefer glorifying that to glorifying esports in general. But second, even if you believe that OG's training is wrong, that the round is about the glorification of video games in general, where all of our arguments will apply there, we're still going to win the round. We're going to do two things. First, we're going to explain why the professional nature of esports, and in particular the glorification, actually leads to a better culture within video games. We're going to do this better with better mechanisms than opening opposition. And second, we're going to tell you that since tons of kids are already addicted to video games, and lots of people will be playing video games in either world, learn far more if they're trying to become professional than if they are just playing for fun. Like the same way that you learn a lot if you're trying to learn the violin or piano. It will teach them discipline and other things. More on that later. Three things. First, rebuttal to CG, then those questions. First, for CG's main extent, this will cause, for example, there's a sunk cost fallacy that companies try to. First, it's a metric. Corporate incentive and the capacity to try to monopolize the market with or without the glorification of professional video games. The reasons for this is, for example, they can do things like in-game purchases, ranking systems. This creates the same type of sunk cost fallacy that CG talks about. Second, even if it's true, I think the harms of addiction are somewhat limited because people grow up. It doesn't just mean their parents stop them from playing, it means that financial pressure on them where they can't keep playing video games. Maybe even if they're at an academy, their friends or their teachers tell them to stop playing video games. And lastly, I mean, that is to say, if there's huge numbers of people getting addicted and it's clearly awful for their lives, parents just won't let them play that particular game. Lastly, I think that video games, that there's a win when you kill someone. I think that is what is most likely to actually get people, not just the fact that there's some professional they look up to. It's like the physiological nature of addiction. First extension. I want to talk about how we change the culture in video games. Opening opposition also makes the same claim, but I think there are two problems with their analysis that opening government points out. First, opening opposition says you get more scrutiny of players, right? But I think it's not clear whether the scrutiny is effective and whether it's good or bad. Like, people already know that Call of Duty is dominated by men over women. And they don't need a bunch of professional players to teach them that. And it's also not clear that people will respond well to this scrutiny. These are all of the problems that opening government points out. Second, there's not clear why it's important to glorify going professional as opposed to glorifying things in general. Like, why is scrutiny of professionals better than scrutiny of non-professionals? It's not clear from opening opposition. We're going to answer that question. Before I do that quickly, I want to respond to some of opening government's mechanisms. They say that, worse than other sports, video games are young and anonymous. To be clear, that is the status quo. That is what they are defending. When there's no glorification, when there's no professionalism, when there's no one you look up to, that's when people are anonymous. On our side of the house, you don't have anonymity. Okay, I want to talk now about why you get less toxic role models and why, in particular, the corporate sponsorships are the best way to ensure this. So, in particular, I think first, corporations, it prevents corporations from denying responsibility for the behavior of players. That is to say, opening opposition says you get more scrutiny, but opening government asks the reasonable question, like, if all video gamers are racist and young and hotheads, like, why will they actually call people out in a good way? What we're saying here is that if you are a corporation, if you're YouTube or if you're Nintendo and you're funding someone, then you are responsible for their actions. That is to say, even if Nintendo, I don't know who makes COD, but if Nintendo created Call of Duty, they're also trying to sell Mario Kart to a completely different audience that is presumably less racist and less sexist. So as a result, they're more likely to pressure their players to not actually do these things. Second, I think you also get better corporations on our side of the house. That is to say, YouTube isn't as involved in the video game industry. They're less likely to be susceptible from the pressure of racists, like that opening government is talking about. Three, I think that corporations are risk averse. So maybe if you're a professional player, it's worth it for you to take the risk to continue to be toxic because you don't want to alienate some fans. But I think corporations are much more likely to be risk averse of getting canceled on the global stage because it will affect all of their revenues as opposed to just one player. So they're more likely to pressure their players. Fourth, and most importantly, when you have corporate sponsorships, it means that people are more likely to listen. That is to say, if you're sponsoring PewDiePie, if you're paying him and you are the one criticizing him, he'll listen to you because you are literally what puts food on his table. On the other hand, if you just have some fans who are criticizing PewDiePie, it's not clear that they're actually going to have an impact. I also want to be clear that the same stuff about accountability applies to the other examples that opening opposition gives. Like, again, they say you get more women in esports, but they don't explain why. Why you need professionals. So expose the fact that there aren't women in esports. I think when you, Nintendo, are funding an entire team that is all male, that's when the criticism goes back to Nintendo as opposed to the player themselves. The reason this spills down to people is because I think these are role models, just like to answer CG's question. I think these are role models. People absolutely challenge their heroes, just the way that John Cena has been challenged by Chinese people when he said that Thailand was a national state. So I think as a result, you're likely to have people look up to these people, and young kids who are impressionable are going to learn better behaviors from them. Take a POI from opening.
You're right that the winner of this debate will prove what better shapes discourse towards being less toxic. However, we give you an incentive that affects all players in the community, which is to make certain discourse more acceptable and directly linked to the amount of subscribers that you get and make people more able to call out bad behavior from the most popular channels. That reaches more people than the few that are sponsored by companies.
Framing defeats this argument when you tell us that people are going to be glorified in either world. That's the top of your DPM. So that's out. OG's out. Their best argument's out. Two, I think even if that's not true, I think we told you that people do criticize their heroes just like John Cena criticized. Second extension. This one's actually super simple. Suppose CG and OG are right that people play a lot more video games because of this. I think even if that's true, I think what happens on our side of the house is that people play it in a way that's competitive, that teaches them how to actually learn to learn. That is to say, you learn discipline, you think critically to diagnose problems. And this is the example I gave earlier. When I learned to play the piano, it literally got me into college. But it's not because it's actually useful. I'm not going to use my fingers in that way any time in the future, right? It's because the college knew that it had taught me discipline and it had taught me, I knew how to learn things. I knew how to actually diagnose the problems that I was having. I think that on our side of the house, the comparative is very simple. Instead of you have kids who are just playing random video games all the time for kill streaks, they play with their friends, they play for fun, maybe they stay up for a long period of time and actually try to figure out what they're doing wrong, what to do better. That skill, even if it's just about shooting a virtual gun, is a good skill. That is to say, the reason I stay up for a long time for debate is because I'm learning how to learn. I'm learning how to get better at things. And I think that even if video games are applicable, learning how to be disciplined is actually good for them. I also just think that this outframes and outbeats both CG and OG on their argument that playing video games are bad for people. Because I've already proven to you in my answers to closing government that people are going to play video games a ton in either world. And guys, this is true. Professional players are new and video games are not. They were super popular before the rise of professional players. But on our side of the house, you actually have kids who are learning how to improve instead of just doing random things for dopamine hits. I think that's far better. I think that teaches them more useful skills. Right to oppose.
All right, I thank that speaker. I now welcome the government whip. I now welcome the final speaker, the opposition whip. Here.
Can you hear me? Yep.
Sorry, could you say that again?
I have no idea what that is. Whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you move your papers? I'm just gonna do it for you. Sorry. Small table, too many papers. Panel, millions of women are harassed every day in league chats and Twitch streams and the like. Because we think people ought to have the ability to pursue hobbies that they enjoy, that they find meaning in, we're so proud to oppose. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk a bit directly about our extension, which gets woefully little engagement from closing government. Then I'm going to talk about how it takes out every other team in this round. First, on the extension. The second part, first, because that gets very little engagement from CG to the detriment of their case. Asher says it is not true that people become more addicted to video games in the sense that they play more video games, but rather that it changes how people play the video games to get going. The reason he gives is that the dopamine hit that you get from winning a game is largely symmetric in either world. What does change, though, is what OG says, which is that people are more like when they look up to people who have put in tons of time, tons of disciplines time in order to become extremely good at something, that it changes how you do the sport. That one, you become more goal-oriented and you spend time in become more goal-oriented, so you set specific goals for yourself and you find ways to reach them. And second, that you do things like you focus on specific issues within your gaming rather than just mindlessly playing for games with your friends, which you think is the comparative. The result is this takes out all of Gup's bench material about how addiction is bad, because you think that largely the effects of a couple additional hours doesn't have that much effect on your education. Like me staying up to 3 a.m. versus 1 a.m. really isn't going to make a difference in the long-term, guys. What does make a difference is having the ability to build skills over time. The way that learning piano or learning violin when you're a child teaches you discipline, teaches you how to learn playing an instrument in ways that we think is important later. The second extension, this takes out CG regardless of any rebuttal we give them. But the second extension is, I think, the second extension which Asher gave first is extremely important as well, because the argument we gave is the real mechanism that OO fails to give about why we change culture. That is, we think the comparative in the world is not no glorification of esports whatsoever, but we think it is the glorification and the niche gamer community paying attention to informal random street girls, people like PewDiePie who do not have corporate support. The argument corporate support actually gives you reasons why specifically professionalizing esports and glorifying the professionalization is necessary to solve culture, even if it's not happening now. We think it'll happen in the long term. The reasons he gives are, first, we think that corporations are directly accountable to more people than the average streamer. That is, a streamer is just responsive to their fan base. On the comparative, if you are EA and you are sponsoring a streamer, whenever that person gets on a stream and says something racist or sexist or homophobic, you have both leverage over them to be able to do it because you're paying their salary, as everyone has pointed out, and 2, you have the incentive to do it because video game companies appeal to a far wider audience than the average streamer, because lots of people play video games who aren't like nerds who are all sexist and homophobic. Not all gamers are that way. So I think they get backlash at the point where they seem like they are paying people who are doing terrible things, versus they can write off the activity of informal streamers as like, oh, we don't have anything to do with that, we can't police the activities from streamers. But B, we think that especially true of sponsors of these things who are not video games or gamers who just want other advertisements on these streams who don't appeal to video gamers in particular and who are therefore accountable to the wider public. This is the mechanism. The Azure gives you other mechanisms too, about increased scrutiny over corporations, about risk aversion too, and about players' responsiveness of players. But this is the important one, because OO totally misses this. OO just says, oh, like, you know, high profile players are higher profile, therefore they're more responsive. That doesn't explain why A, they're likely to be called out in the way that OO wants, and B, why the players are likely to respond. We say that the reason they respond is because they're responsible to people who are paying their bills. That is why this wins this round. 3 impacts to this. First, players are pressured by EFD, I'll take you in a bit, by their sponsors to call out abuse. I'm going to respond to what CEO says, is that this doesn't actually change behavior. A couple of responses. I lost a piece of paper. A couple things here. A, OG, everyone says that kids are susceptible, which means that yes, I think they are likely to do so if they see their role models calling out racist abuse. B, I think even if that's not true, I think women and people who feel marginalized independently feel better at the point at which high-profile people are calling things calling things other. But finally, I think that like people aren't just like naturally always sexist and racist. Like some of this stuff is habits, ways of speaking that become normalized. You can also unnormalize it. I don't think it's the end of the world. But second, it also I set 2 other impacts to the extension. Second, I think that corporations can. Second, I think that corporations will choose good role models, people to sponsor, which beats the CEO argument about us all being violent young men. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Logical fallacy of companies policing toxic behavior is that it is impossible to supervise and regulate, and also that in the status quo, the companies who are sponsoring players are still making a profit even though they continue to perpetuate toxic culture, because a comfy chair still looks comfy even if the person sitting in it is being horrible to women.
One, it is a problem at the point at which there's backlash against you and you lose money. So the second part of your POI, the premise is just false. But second, we're not saying they're policing everyone's actions. They're policing the actions of the people they literally sponsor. Okay, how does this beat the rest around? On OO, our mechanisms fill in the 2 holes, which means they lose. That is, one, they just say that higher scrutiny on high-profile people is the mechanism, but they don't say why that higher scrutiny is on the racist abuse rather than like you're just shitty at gaming. Second, they just say that you get more media attention if all white. But the problem is the media already knows there's toxicity in gaming. The question is how that spills over to affect people. We fill in that hole, which is that the media affect the corporations, which affect the players. The second and broader problem with OO is that their case is about the glorification of video games and not about the glorification of pros. E.g., if video games are still glorified, then you still get the benefits of other kids thinking gamers are cool in school, and that gamers are cool in school. So almost all of their cases not unique. We have given you the reason why this is particularly essential. CG, briefly. One, the first extension just beats them because it proves that addiction is not bad, and it also proves that it's largely marginal, that is, additional hours doesn't make that big of a deal. But second, their mechanisms all do not make sense. That is, I think their argument about sunk cost doesn't make sense, because if you really hate it, if you're really bored, if you're really frustrated with the game, you're just not going to play it. But third, I also think that largely there's like symmetric corporate incentives here to get people addicted. The difference is whether or not you feel there's a community as part of the addiction, whether or not there's sports and role models that you and other people have in common, so largely they have no impact. Finally, on OG. First, on the argument about extreme act like staying up at 2 a.m., I think this is marginal. People do this for e-worlds and shit all the time. Who cares? But second, on culture, I think first their argument is largely symmetric. If it's true the community is toxic, then it's all not true that you can call out people and sort of call out people either way. But second, we have explained the actual reason why this can be called out. That is, corporations do the calling out, not like people calling out random Twitch streamers because of the existence of the community. That's the only way that you actually get around community toxicity. Finally, on consumption, we have told you that largely this is symmetric. To the extent it's not symmetric, we say it is good because it encourages discipline. Look, we reduce harassment against people who do not deserve it. We help people be filled with discipline and important skills we're so proud to oppose.
All right, I thank all speakers. Thank you for the debate. You may head back to the main Zoom call while the judges